let's pray.
He's your new son.
Uh-huh. Merciful Father, your word was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. Grant us sound interpretation of all Scriptures, that we may receive all their comfort and hope according to your Holy Spirit's will and intent. Grant that we abide in this simple, direct, and useful exposition that is permanently and well grounded in your revealed will. Teach us to flee all abstruse and specious questions and disputations, so that we reject and condemn all things contrary to your true, simple, and useful teachings, through the same Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, questions? Any questions? Yes, sir.
Do you want to interpret the last third of that prayer that you had?
No. I don't. It's in the Lutheran Study Bible at the back of it. And
But you've got to realize that I'm a simple man.
I get that. I get that.
Didn't have to agree with me.
So am I in error now for agreeing with the words that you just spoke?
Yes, you were wrong.
Yes.
Can't win.
Okay. I will say this: abstruse means difficult to understand, obscure. So an interpretation that is difficult to understand or obscure would tend to lead towards error. So that word I knew was a new vocabulary word for me as well. I haven't heard that one. I've heard obtuse.
Your vocabulary is much greater than mine.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we can work on that. I like sharing my vocab words. Mikey.
Okay. When Jesus is being crucified.
Yep.
Yeah, that you on either side. Yeah. Where is it that they always say the thief on the cross, but where does it say that he's where do they get the idea that he's a thief?
Okay, so we get this from the fuller context when you take the different Gospels together, that we learn that the two people that Jesus is crucified between, that they were thieves. And so we learn that from other Gospels.
Is that really a controversial crucifixion?
Well, it depends on what you steal.
You stole somebody's life.
Right. So the Romans, let's just say crucifixion wasn't merely about punishing crime. Crucifixion was used by the Romans to make a statement. It was a form of psychological warfare.
It's like similar to public hangings.
Yes. So this is what happens to those who don't obey us, break our laws, or try to subvert our the Pax Romana and fight against the emperor. And so the crucifixion was reserved for non-Roman citizens whom the Romans wanted to make a public example of. And in fact, in our gospel text today in Luke, it used the word spectacle, which is the right way to put it. Public executions historically have been spectacles, and which is one of the reasons why coming into the 20th century, even the United States has shied away from and gotten rid of the public spectacle of executions. Now they are done, in prisons, behind closed doors, and only certain people are allowed. But in the past, when hangings would take place, the whole town, everybody would come to see, and oftentimes the people in the crowd at public executions would taunt and jeer and mock and insult, and we know this has happened to Jesus as well.
There will also be vendors.
Say that again?
There will also be vendors.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Get your souvenirs here. Yes, we have a hangman's noose that you can bring home and play with your dollies, and here we've got the executioner's axe, and look at this, a guillotine that actually clips the ends of cigars. This is great. So, yeah.
Remember, no news is bad news.
Oh.
You can see yourself, Matt. Those blazing saddles. That was working.
Okay. Leviticus chapter 14.
You got your work cut out.
Yes. Leviticus 14. We are going to rework our way through the small portion that we have looked at, and we're going to note what is being described here as far as what is being created is a mixture of ingredients, including fresh water, for the purpose of declaring, using on a leper who has been cleansed, for the purpose of them being made clean. And so, let me find a text in the Gospels real quick here. The word is heifer, and I want to do a gospel search. Hold on a second here. Maybe it's in the New Testament. Let me go. Here we go. Listen to this from Hebrews chapter 9. If the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is because in the book of Numbers, there is a second cocktail that has very similar ingredients, and there's one ingredient that's just a little bit different. So you'll have the hyssop, you'll have the scarlet yarn, you'll have the water, but with the one that's used in the book of Numbers, the concoctions that's made with the water, it will also include the ashes of a heifer that had been sacrificed, and that then is used for the purpose of being used to make somebody clean who has touched or been in direct contact with a corpse. And this was a necessary thing for them to go from being unclean to being clean. And so you'll note then that this is all referencing something here. And I think it's vital for us to remember what's going on here. And let me do a little bit of work this way. Hebrews chapter 10. I'll work backwards in the book of Hebrews just to kind of reemphasize this point. For since, this is Hebrews 10:1, for since the law, and I'm going to note here, I'm going to come over and take a look at the Greek. In the Greek, and I know this is all Greek to you, it says ha namas. Ha means the, and so that's your definite article. So ha namas, it's talking about the Torah. We're talking about law in the sense not of a specific command, but in the broader sense of this is talking about the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. For since the Torah has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, you'll note that's an incomplete sentence so far, but note then, this is explicitly saying what we see in the Old Testament. These are shadows. These are types. I know I keep hammering on that, but I want to kind of drive home this idea that the Bible teaches us this is how we are to read the Scriptures. So people who have a difficult time making sense of the Old Testament, and they're in a chapter like Leviticus 14, and they're reading, why am I having to read about scarlet yarn, hyssop, and water, and being used to sprinkle leprous people so that they can be declared clean? Why in the book of Numbers do we have a similar thing with the heifer and all this type of stuff? Answer, because according to Hebrews 10, here we have an interpretive key, and that interpretive key tells us that these are shadows. These are types and shadows, but they do not have the true form of the realities. So over here, we have this wonderful picture right now occurring in front of our very eyes. Here, this plant is receiving this beautiful sunlight, right? So this is the true form, this is the reality. But if you look on the ground, you can see the shape, kind of. You can see the shadow cast by the reality. Does that make sense? So the Old Testament then, the Old Testament is the shadows. It's the sunlight, and you look on the ground and you go, that looks a lot like the shape of Jesus. But you'll notice in shadows, you miss all the 3 dimensions and things like that. You can kind of make out the form. I couldn't tell you what kind of plant that is by looking at the shadow. But the true form then is the plant itself. So note the sunlight against the plant is casting the shadow. This is the true form. So Christ is the true form. And in the Old Testament, the shadows are pointing back to Him. Does that make sense? Okay.
So how did they know enough to write that back then?
I would say, remember that all Scripture is God-breathed. Because the more I work in the Bible, the more convinced there's no possible way any human beings could have put this thing together the way it was put together. It is so clearly inspired by God, so that not only do we have clear prophecies regarding Jesus, like where he would be born, that he would be born of a virgin, that he would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, and even his cry of dereliction on the cross is there in the Psalms, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, it's amazing prophecies where specific details of the life of Christ that he fulfilled were there. Things that he couldn't possibly have tried to fulfill if he wanted to. Stuff that, that had to be fulfilled, by him passively. But on top of that then, here in Leviticus 14, we're getting a shadow. And we noted 2 weeks ago that the shadow was prefiguring the true reality, which is going to be baptism. Baptism where the blood of Christ is mixed together with water and the Word, and that it is a washing for the forgiveness of sins. So this prefiguring here in Leviticus 14 is a shadow of baptism. But let me keep reading then in 10. So a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities. It can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered year after year, make perfect those who draw near. Talking about draw near to the temple. A little bit of a note here. This part of this sentence, this first sentence in verse 1 of chapter 10, notice that it's written with the assumption that the temple is still a thing, that the temple is still going on. What year was the temple destroyed? 70 AD. 70 AD. 70 AD. So this epistle was written prior to 70 AD. Earlier then. And you can tell by paying attention to the details. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshipers have once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sin? But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of goats to take away sins. It's impossible. So animal sacrifices do not take away sins. That's not the purpose of the Mosaic law or of the sacrifices that we're reading about. The purpose of these sacrifices is a reminder of sin. And there are portions, and we're a ways away from them, there are portions of the book of Numbers, especially near the end of the book of Numbers, where it lists out all of these different sacrifices, and God piles on even more sacrifices that are required, that there are certain times of the year, there were so many animals being sacrificed for particular feast days in the temple that in the ancient world it was described as having a river of blood flowing from it. That's how many the sacrifices were. And all of this then is a reminder of sin. Now coming back to Hebrews chapter 9, specifically I wanted to look at verse 13, but I'll start at verse 11. So when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, even through the greater and more perfect tent not made with hands, that is of this creation, he entered once and for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. And then here's that reference. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, well, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who has made it must be established, and a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood, for when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool, there it is again, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And so then you'll note that here, scarlet wool and hyssop make an appearance with the establishing of the old covenant. And so these ingredients, as we look in Leviticus 14, we must consider them in light of their significance by virtue of the fact that they are shadows. They're shadows on the ground, and the true substance is pointing us to something in the New Testament, the true reality. So Leviticus 14, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing." And leprosy is used in Scripture as a picture of the effects of sin. So you want sin and the fact that we are born with this condition of sin. It's like leprosy. It's this invasion and corruption of our body. So when a leper is cleansed, it is then a picture of somebody who is saved by Christ and who and is cleansed of their sins. So he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then if the case of the leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. Now, you're going to note here, our gospel text today, the Passion of Christ from Luke 23, Barabbas goes free. Christ is sacrificed. And here, with these 2 little birds, one bird is killed, and its blood is poured into fresh water in an earthenware vessel where you have cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And you dip all of this together, as well as the living bird, in the blood of the dead bird. Here, these tiny little birds, show us, again, a picture of the salvation. The one is left free, the other dies. Christ is crucified, Barabbas is free to go. So he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. This concoction of blood, cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet yarn is sprinkled then on the leper 7 times. Then he shall pronounce him clean and shall let the living bird go into the open field. Interesting. Same thing happens on the Day of Atonement with the scapegoat. Same thing. One animal is sacrificed, the other is let free. He who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and that will include eyebrows, which is weird. Okay. So, you ever seen anybody without eyebrows? I mean, it just does not look right. So, it just doesn't look right. So, all the hair goes. He's to be cleansed. He shall shave off all his hair, bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent for 7 days. And on the 7th day he shall shave off all his hair from his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. In case he said, do I have to shave my eyebrows? Yes. He shall shave off all of his hair, and then shall wash his clothes, and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean. It just makes me wonder, this kind of harkens to small babies, although some babies are born with a lot of hair, but, a lot of babies are bald when they're born, So on the 8th day is the first day of the new creation. Remember, 6 days God creates the heavens and the earth, rests on the 7th. Christ is raised on the 8th day. Always that 8th day is, in one way or another, symbolic, a shadow of the first day of the new creation. On the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, 1 ewe lamb, a year old, one without blemish, a grain offering, 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, 1 log of oil. And you'll note here, grain offering harkens to bread. And I would argue that when it comes to unleavened bread, there is no greater unleavened bread than unbaked bread. You see what I'm saying? It hasn't been baked yet. It's fine flour at this point. And it's mixed with oil. That oil is hearkening to the anointing of Christ. Each of these elements, you can kind of connect back to Jesus. So the priest who cleanses him shall set the man who is to be cleansed and these things before Yahweh at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest shall take one of the male lambs, offer it for a guilt offering, along with the log of oil, wave them for a wave offering before Yahweh. He shall kill the lamb in the place where they kill the sin offering and the burnt offering in the place of the sanctuary. For the guilt offering, like the sin offering, belongs to the priest. It is most holy. So this means that the priests get to consume the sacrifice. The priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, on the big toe of his right foot. So we got lobe, thumb, big toe. Yeah. I've heard conflicting ways in which to understand this. That's why I'm not quite sure what to do with this. I would note this. I like to always pull it back to Christ, that Christ has the crown of thorns pressed into his head, his hands and his feet are nailed. And so I think in some ways it's taking the wounds of Christ and putting them on that person. So then the priest shall take some of the log of oil, pour it into the palm of his own left hand, dip his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand, sprinkle some oil with his finger 7 times before Yahweh. Some of the oil that remains in his hand the priest shall put on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Again, that's a clear reference to Christ. This is an anointing. And on top of the blood of the guilt offering, and the rest of the oil that is the priest's hand, he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed. Then the priest shall make atonement for him before Yahweh. And you're going to note here, notice the passive nature of making atonement. And this is an important aspect of this. Christ is our high priest. He has made atonement for us. The person offering the sacrifice is not making atonement for themselves. That's not how that works. So it's the priest then who fulfills the function, and he makes atonement for the person. So then the priest shall offer the sin offering, make atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanness, and afterwards he shall kill the burnt offering, and the priest shall offer the burnt offering, the grain offering on the altar. Thus the priest shall make atonement for him. And here we go, something prefiguring the absolution. And he shall be clean. Just like when the sacrifices are made, and he shall be forgiven. He shall be clean. The sacrifice is done for him. The sprinkling occurs on him and is done to him, and now he shall be clean. A little type and shadow, a picture of our being cleansed from sin. Now, of course, you'll note that the ingredients for some of these things, some of the sacrifices, may start to cost a wee bit of money. And the one thing we know about lepers, especially if they've been lepers for a long time, they don't exactly get to go to work every day and work at the office or at a job. They have to live outside the city, and they have to say, when people come by, I'm unclean, I'm a leper, stay away, right? So how they make their money then is probably through people giving them alms, and it has to be done at a distance. So lepers are not known for having padded bank accounts. Far from it. So what then if you have a leper whose God has cleansed of his leprosy and he can't afford these sacrifices? Do not despair. If he's poor and cannot afford so much, then he shall take one male lamb for a guilt offering to be waved, to make atonement for him, and 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour with oil for a grain offering, and a log of oil. Also 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, which are not worth much. You know, best pigeon is a dead pigeon. That's what I always like to think. Anyway, I don't particularly care for those birds. They're like rats with wings. Anyway, So 2 turtle doves, 2 pigeons, whichever he can afford. One shall be a sin offering, the other a burnt offering. And on the 8th day he shall bring them for his cleansing to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting before Yahweh. And the priest shall take the lamb of the guilt offering and the log of oil, and the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before Yahweh. And he shall kill the lamb for the guilt offering, and the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, put it on the lobe of his right ear of him who is to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the priest shall pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and he shall sprinkle with his right finger some of the oil that is in his left hand 7 times before Yahweh. And the priest shall put some of the oil that is in his hand on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, in the place where the blood of the guilt offering was put. And the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed, to make atonement for him before Yahweh. And he shall offer of the turtle doves or pigeons, whichever he can afford, one for a sin offering, the other for a burnt offering, along with the grain offering. And the priest shall make atonement before Yahweh for him who is being cleansed. This is the law for him who is a case of leprous disease, who cannot afford the offerings for his cleansing. All right, types, shadows, reminders of sin. Ultimately, the substance, the true form is found in Christ. We continue. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when you come to the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, and I put a case of leprous disease in a house in the land of your possession, then he who owns the house shall come and tell the priest. This, by the way, sounds a lot like a mold infection, what's going to be described here. Your house can get leprosy. It's a kind of a broad category. And there seems to be, there seems to me to be some case of disease in my house. Then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priest goes to examine the disease, lest all that is in the house be declared unclean. And afterwards the priest shall go in to see the house, and he shall examine the disease. If the disease is in the walls of the house with greenish or reddish spots, and if it appears to be deeper than the surface, then the priest shall go out of the house to the door of the house, shut up the house for 7 days. I want you to consider this for a second, just by way of like hygiene. Certain molds, if they get into your house, they will kill you. They will flat out kill you. Now, we don't have that much of a problem here in this climate due to this fact. The winters are Sahara Desert dry here. And in order for molds, really the toxic kinds to really get going, you need a very humid climate. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get mold up here, but that's not what I'm saying. But move down to Florida. Move down to Florida. You live in a house that doesn't, the basement doesn't empty properly or things like that. And now the house is like humid all 24/7. You're going to get mold in that thing. It's going to get into the walls. It's going to get into the rafters. And there's only one solution once it gets to a particular point. You got to take the house down. Because living in it, it'll kill you. It will kill you quick. It'll kill you faster than cigarettes. Now, that being the case, consider then what's being described here are homes that have a mold infection. We even got the colors of these molds, which means we could probably backwards engineer this and figure out which molds are being talked about here. And so as an Israelite, now God has said in the types and shadows, your house can get leprosy. Your house can get leprosy, and if it does, your house can be declared unclean. And the result of this is that you have to be cognizant of what's going on in your house. Uh-oh, what's that? What is with the greenish splotches on the walls here? We better call the priest. The priest says your house is unclean. But by doing this, you're saving people's lives. Isn't it fascinating that God chose to use mold as a type and shadow of sin and uncleanness? And by this little procedure now, Israelites who couldn't even begin to tell you how mold does what mold does and how dangerous mold is, they just know God says you got to be looking out for this thing, and if your house has this, Your house could be declared unclean. The priest has got to make the call. The priest comes in and says, yeah, your house is unclean. You got a leprous disease in here. They're being spared. Their lives are actually being spared in the days before we understand how microbes and things like that work. So the priest shall go out of the house, shut the door for 7 days. The priest shall come again on the 7th day and look. If the disease has spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they take out the stones in which which is the disease, and throw them into an unclean place outside the city. And he shall have the inside of the house scraped all around, and the plaster that they scrape off they shall pour out in an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and put them in the place of those stones, and he shall take other plaster and plaster the house. If the disease breaks out again in the house after he has taken out the stones and scraped the house and plastered it, then the priest shall go and look. If the disease has spread in the house, it is a persistent leprous disease in the house, it is unclean. And he shall break down the house, its stones and timber, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall carry them out of the city to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever enters the house while it is shut up shall be unclean until the evening, and whoever sleeps in the house shall wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house shall wash his clothes. Isn't that fascinating? So you've just spent time inside of an unclean house with a mold infection, and you are then required to wash your clothes. Isn't that interesting? But if the priest comes and looks, and if the disease has not spread in the house after the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean, for the disease is healed. And for the cleansing of the house, he shall take 2 small birds with cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. Now your house gets to be baptized, right? And shall kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over the fresh water, and shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet yarn along with the live bird, dip them in the blood of the bird that was killed and in the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. Thus she shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, and with the fresh water, and with the live bird, and with the cedar wood, and the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. And he shall let the live bird go out of the city into the open country. So he shall make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. Houses need to have atonement made for them? Why would that be? Is my house a sinner? Well, truly sinners live there. I'll agree with you that. Let's take a look at Romans 8.
Aren't you going to finish this chapter?
We'll get there. We'll get there. My goal is to drag it out as long as possible. Yeah, we're going to be in chapter 14 for the next 3 more weeks. So.
2-to-1 odds. I'll take your money.
Yeah. Listen to what Paul writes in Romans 8. I'll start in verse 18 for our context. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revelation of the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons and the redemption of our bodies. So you'll note in Romans 8, it makes it very clear that the creation itself has been subjected to futility. and corruption. Do you know that there are no weeds? No weeds in the new earth. None. There will be no mold in the new earth that will destroy houses. This is the impact of sin. So think of it this way then. Christ bleeds and dies for the sins of the whole world, and his atoning sacrifice will have the ultimate effect of redeeming a sinful, fallen creation, including us. And we're all going to be saved then through death and resurrection. The creation itself will pass away. It will die. It is being impacted severely by our sin, and everything that you see will be destroyed, and God will resurrect the creation itself, and there will be a new creation. So it is not a superfluous, weird thing that houses can be declared unclean, because houses are made up of the stuff of the earth, of the creation, and they are subjected to futility. I want to find the weeds text real quick. See if I can find this. And I think it's in the Psalms. Well, let's see. Maybe not. Old Testament. I'm going to have to find it later. Bummer for me. I'll have to hunt this down. There is a text in the Psalm, and I've got to find it, where the psalmist literally talks about the fact that if, in the new creation, if there were weeds, I would muster my armies to fight them. But alas, there are not, It's an interesting thing. So in the creation itself, everything is subjected to futility, including your house. And I would argue the reason why Lowe's, Home Depot, and Menards exist is because our homes are subjected to futility, and we're always having to bring them back to the state that they should be in.
Wasn't it like from Adam? He was created into and lived in the Garden of Eden.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and it was at the time that they made the ultimate sin, is when we've had leprosy, weeds, all things that challenge us in our daily living.
Uh-huh.
And this what they're trying to explain to us in Leviticus here is that we will be plagued with them, but not necessarily. They have a section in the Bible with all the plagues too. That's before Leviticus. So.
Yep.
But these weeds, wouldn't it be nice for a farmer to be able to farm without them? It just doesn't happen.
No, and not only that,
I need the help of Monsanto.
Right. I always am fascinated, like when I drive out in this, when I drive out in this area in the summertime, and you get those yellow plains, So I'm driving down the highway heading towards Kongsvinger, and all of a sudden, vroom, right across the road. I mean, like feet above my truck, there's this barnstorming weed crop duster is doing his thing. What's he doing? He's killing bugs and killing weeds. There will be no need for crop dusters in the new earth, which I'm very happy about. I've got to find this text, but I can't find it. Oh, bummer. All right, let's continue on. Are you ready, Dave? Are you ready? Here we go. This is the law for any case of leprous disease, for an itch, for leprous disease in a garment, or in a house, or for a swelling, or for an eruption, or a spot, to show when it is unclean and when it is clean. This is the law for leprous disease. We did it. We made it to chapter 14. We're going to have some cake afterwards. Yeah. And you're going to wish we were still in 14 as soon as I turn the page. Because this is again part of the icky bio portions of the book of Leviticus. Again, always as I read this, I'm so thankful I am not a Levitical priest. that I am a new covenant pastor. That's all I have to say. So Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, this discharge is unclean. This is the law of his uncleanness for a discharge, whether his body runs with his discharge or his body is blocked up in his discharge, it is his uncleanness. Every bed on which the one with the discharge lies shall be unclean. Everything on it in which he sits shall be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed shall wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. And whoever sits on anything in which the one with the discharge has sat shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whoever touches the body of the one with the discharge shall wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening." You'll notice discharges here then are an effect of sin. If the one who with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, then he shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And any saddle on which the one with the discharge rides shall be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean until the evening. And whoever carries such things shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Anyone whom the one with the discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in water shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until evening. Take a look at that, washing his hands. So you note then now we're getting to discharges that have to do with illnesses. And of course this is rather disgusting. And this is now held up again as a picture of the effects of sin. And you are to recognize what is clean and what is unclean. And in this particular case, you've come in contact who has a discharge as a result of an illness, and you are to wash your hands. These are the things that spread diseases. This is why we have hand sanitizers now, right? God knew this all the way back then. And in this type and shadow of sin and its effects of being clean and unclean, we have a command to wash your hands, and this command is for the purpose of you not getting the ew on you, and you end up being the one with the discharge. It's very fascinating. An earthenware vessel that the one with the discharge touches shall be broken. Every vessel of wood shall be rinsed in water. And when the one with the discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and he shall bathe his body in fresh water, and shall be clean. Isn't it interesting that like most diseases like this, they pretty much run their course in about a week or a little longer, right? And on the 8th day he shall take 2 turtle doves, 2 pigeons, and come before Yahweh to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest, and the priest shall use them, one for a sin offering, the other for a burnt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him before Yahweh for his discharge. Put more bluntly, the person who finds themselves ill in such a way that they end up needing Pepto-Bismol, afterwards they have to go and there's a sacrifice for their being cleansed of that illness. If a man has a emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and be unclean until the evening. Every garment and every skin on which the semen comes shall be washed with water and be unclean until the evening. If a man lies with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them shall bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. Everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything also on which she sits shall be unclean. Whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whether it is the bed or anything on which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until the evening. And if any man lies with her, and her menstrual impurity comes upon him, he shall be unclean for 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. Now this then has impact then for the story that we read about the woman who has an issue of blood for 12 years. She is unclean for 12 years. 12. In fact, it's worth reviewing, this woman who is impacted by this command in the Gospel of Mark chapter 5, and we'll take a look at some of the interesting Greek here. Mark 5:21, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side. So he's coming back onto the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee, if you were to look at it, it's in the northern part of Israel. The western bank is going to be Gentile territory. Eastern side, with the exception of the southeastern side, is Capernaum and places like that. That's all Jewish settlement. So Jesus coming back across, he had traveled across the sea with the disciples to the area of the Gerasenes. That's where the demoniac of the Gerasenes was. And now he's coming back, and he's landed at Capernaum, which is his home base of operations. He actually has a home there. And so when Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. Now, I always like to point out that there's an interesting play on words here. Be made well, sothe, is from the Greek verb sozo, means to save. So it's kind of fascinating. This word is used for salvation in the truest sense. We're sozo, we're saved by what Christ has done. But it's also used in a temporal sense. So if you have a disease and you are made well, then you are saved. It's fascinating how that works. So it has this interesting double entendre. So he literally says, lay your hands on her so that she may be saved and live. And you can then decide how it best goes. Interesting play on words. So he went with him. A great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So you get this idea. Jesus, there's a whole group of people like a river now going up towards Jairus' house. Jesus is in the midst of that throng. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. What we've just read in Leviticus 15, this woman is unclean. Everything she sits on is unclean. Her bed is unclean. She has been forbidden from participating in the worship life of her own community for 12 years. She can't even go to the synagogue because anything she sits down on, she's going to make unclean. She's just a walking pile of uncleanliness. She's not allowed to touch people. She's not allowed to be there. And she has come up with this brilliant plan. She's going to sneak a miracle. Why is she having to sneak it? Because she can't come to Jesus. She's unclean. She's got to stay out of his presence. But she's taken it upon herself to concoct a way in which to overcome all of this. So, there was a woman who had a discharge of blood 12 years. I find it fascinating that Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. This woman has had an issue of blood for 12 years. Now, she suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. Let's just say medical technology wasn't all that brilliant in the time of Christ. So she's desperate to be able to no longer be unclean, and every effort on her part has only resulted in the situation getting worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Now we know from the cross references in the other Gospels what this is referring to. And I wonder if I can pull that up. All right, so here we have some Orthodox Jews. And the book of Numbers requires that they have these tassels coming off the corners of their shirts. And these are called tsitzioth. Tzitzith would be the singular, tsitzioth is the plural. And so these are the tassels. These are that's being referred to here. So Jesus, he's keeping the law perfectly for us. His garments will include tsitzioth, where he's got 4 of them, 2 coming off the front corners, 2 coming off the back corners. And so there Jesus is walking towards Jairus' house, and his tsitzioth are flapping in the wind, and this woman has the brilliant idea she's going to swim in through the crowd, and all she's got to do is touch one of those. That's it. And she knows that she's going to be healed. And that's what she does. It's a brilliant plan. Except she didn't take something into consideration. Now here's what she says, though. She says, if I touch even his garments, I will be, and here's this word again, saved. If I touch even his garments, I will be saved. So immediately she touches it, and the flow of blood dries up. She felt in her body she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Which makes no sense. I mean, imagine, if you would, that you got tickets to go to see the Vikings play, in October. Yeah. They were given to you for free. Yeah. So, and they were playing the Patriots. You might go. Yeah. You might go for the sake of the Patriots, right? But so you arrive at the stadium, you get out of your car, you go through the ticket style. In fact, there's a line, and then once you're just in this group of people. And guess what's happening to you? You're getting touched. It just happens. And crowds have this weird way of kind of moving this way and moving that way and doing their thing. So there's Jesus in the midst of this crowd, thronged about him, and he says, whoa, who touched me? Which then explains the next part. So his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? This doesn't make any sense, Jesus. And now Jesus doesn't say anything. He just starts looking around. This woman knows for a fact she's just stolen a miracle. She knows for a fact she's unclean, has been unclean, and she shouldn't have been doing what she did. She broke so many commands, if you would, doing what she did, that I'm sure at this point she's expecting she's going to be brought up on charges, taken outside the city, and stoned. That's to be expected at this point. And she has no reason, because I put it this way, 12 years of being unclean, 12 years of not being able to go to church, 12 years, that feels like God is, well, he doesn't love you, he hates you. This woman has experienced the consequences of sin, and not just her consequences, but the consequences of the whole creation falling apart in a way that her experience here has left her completely destroyed. So now Jesus says, who touched me? And he's looking around, and the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. So here she's at this point. And I don't know if you've noticed that when any human being, especially women, get to this point, usually there's tears. And when you're that frightened and you're that crying and you're that scared, you need a Kleenex. I mean, this is what's going on. This woman has completely come apart. So she came in fear and trembling, and she fell down before Jesus, and she told him the whole truth. The law has been broken. She has touched Jesus when she's so unclean, and Jesus doesn't rebuke her. First words out of his mouth is thugater. It's kindness. He says, oh, daughter, your faith has, and the Greek word is sozo, your faith has saved you. Go in peace And here's a fascinating word. And be healed from your mastigos. It gets translated as disease, and that isn't even nearly strong enough. Mastigos is what happens to you when the Roman soldiers take your arms, put them up in the shackles, put you against a pole, strip your shirt off your back and pull out the cat of nine tails and beat on your back until it opens up and starts bleeding. That's a mastigos. It's a scourging. And Jesus says to her, be saved from your scourging. Which means he totally understood what she had just gone through. And not only does he heal her, he forgives her, he comforts her, and he empathizes with her in what she went through for 12 years. Yeah?
Two questions. One, what does it mean when they say Jesus precede power had gone out of him? And then two, would Jesus have been considered unclean because someone touched his robe? Would he have to wash?
Yeah, that's the thing about Jesus. That's the thing about Jesus. Let's talk. I'll have to read the rest of the story to answer the question. But as far as what does it mean to have power go out of... Listen, I don't have any power. So I couldn't tell you what that feels like. My wife is very thankful that I am not a deity, because I'd be a terrible one. But the idea then is that Christ being God, he knows when power goes out of him. He's all-knowing. And so he perceived, there was some way in which he knew that power, his power as God, had gone out from him. And notice, Jesus had no volition in this. This woman just totally snuck and stole this. Now, to answer your next question, to strengthen her faith. Yeah, all of this is for her. Now, let's continue on. Jesus isn't allowed to touch dead bodies either. So listen, Kate, take your question. Is Jesus unclean? Let's kind of let that hang out in space for a second here. So while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Isn't that what... anxiety is just fear on steroids, right? So now you've had somebody who's died, and now he's just terribly afraid. The guy, Jairus at this point, has just gone to feel like he's utterly, failed. But on top of that, you have to wonder, is there any sense in which he's thinking, if that woman who had been unclean for 12 years hadn't slowed everything down, then maybe Jesus would have made it on time? Because he was in a race against death, and now he just lost the race. So Jesus says, do not fear, only believe. So now Jesus gets rid of the crowd. He only allowed Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, to come with him. In order for something to be established, you need two witnesses. Jesus takes 2 + 1. So they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping, wailing loudly, and when they had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but is sleeping. Only Jesus gets to talk this way about death, by the way. It's just this weirdest thing. So they laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He actually throws them out. Took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went where the child was. And watch this. This child's dead. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Notice again, another instance of the tenderness of Christ. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and that they told them to give her something to eat. That little piece of there tells us that this girl probably got so sick that as the illness ran its course, she couldn't keep any food down. Whatever killed her involved a lot of vomiting, and it just overcame. And so now we've got Jesus technically being touched by an unclean woman, but it says that the flow of blood immediately shut up. And now Jesus takes a dead girl by the hand, and she's alive. Which direction are things running? Here in the sinful creation, as sinners, uncleanness gets passed around. But Jesus is God. So when something unclean touches him, he doesn't become unclean, they become clean. When he touches a dead body, that body ceases to be dead. So Jesus never once had to offer any sacrifices or be cleansed for touching a woman who was unclean or for touching dead bodies. And you could see that this had to kind of like, it was hard for the Jews to wrap their heads around it, because you could see as Jesus was getting ready to take this dead corpse by the hand, you could, in slow motion, I always like to see, like this point, the camera cranks to super slow-mo, and the Jews go, no. Jesus, stop. Right? And so the answer to the question is, no, Jesus is never unclean. The unclean are made clean by him. Jesus is never corrupted by a corpse. He makes the corpse alive.
Peter loses his mind.
Yeah. Peter's mind. All right, we'll pick this up again next week.